In this lecture, you're going to learn about the acquisition of Florida and the Missouri Compromise. At the end of this lecture, you need to be able to describe the cause and outcome of the First Seminole War in Florida, explain how the Adams-Onis Treaty gave the United States control of Florida, and explain the function and importance of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. After the French and Indian War in 1763, Spain gave Florida to the British. This map is from that time period. Back then, Florida was divided into East Florida and West Florida. East Florida included the peninsula and was governed by St. Augustine. So this area right here was governed by St. Augustine. You can see it right there. This is a map from the time period. West Florida was the panhandle over here and was governed by Pensacola, which is right in here. At the time, Florida stretched all the way to where the Mississippi River is. So the area of today of Mississippi and Alabama that's right here, that was all part of Florida. During the American Revolution, many Loyalists fled the 13 colonies to Florida, much like those who were escaping to places like Canada and Britain. After the Revolution ended in 1783, Florida was returned to the Spanish under the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the American Revolution. The U.S. claimed that West Florida was actually part of the Louisiana Purchase, but France and Spain both disagreed with that. Spain maintained control of Florida until 1818, and the Spanish encouraged settlers by offering grants of free land to people who migrated there from Spain. As American settlers pushed west from the original 13 states, the Creek Indians from Alabama and Georgia were displaced, and they were pushed south into Florida. These Indians became known as the Seminole. The Seminole tribes offered sanctuary or safety to escaped slaves. The escaped slaves that joined the Seminole tribe were known as Black Seminoles, and you can see an artist rendering from the time period of one of the Black Seminoles in the picture. All right, we've got our first practice. You've got 4 statements based on the notes that you've already taken. You're going to mark each one as a true or false statement. If it's a false statement, you have space provided on your worksheet. You're going to change it into a true statement. So you can pause the video if you need to and take the time to do that. In 1817, President James Monroe sent troops under the command of Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, to secure the U.S.-Florida border. Aside from the fact that lots of expensive slaves were escaping into Florida, the Americans and Seminoles were being antagonistic toward one another. The Americans would sneak across the border to steal Seminole cattle, and the Seminole would raid American villages and provide shelter to escaped slaves. Jackson, in characteristic fashion, decides the best way to secure the border was to invade and conquer Florida, thereby eliminating the border entirely. He crosses into Florida and wages war against the Seminole tribes and returns fugitive slaves that he captures to their owners. Once he defeats the Seminoles, then he goes after the Spanish. The problem is, he did not have the permission of Monroe or the government to do this, and it created a big international incident. Spain was understandably angry. We need to look at some of the larger issues Spain was dealing with at the time to understand why they sort of give in to the United States in this incident. At one time, Spain had the largest empire in the Americas. By the early 1800s, however, many Spanish colonies in the Americas were fighting for their independence, inspired by leaders like Simon Bolivar. If you look at this map, you can see the years many of these countries were gaining independence. It shows that the strength of Spain was waning, and it was struggling to maintain its old mercantilist empire. So you can see, even by 1821, all of these areas that you see in blue have already gotten their independence from the Spanish. So Florida is one of the few spots that they still have a stranglehold on. Many Americans were sympathetic to these independence movements that were going on in Latin America. They thought of themselves as kind of brothers in trying to fight off European colonization. Unfortunately for Spain, it had more territory than it could effectively control at this time. Florida itself was not considered to be one of the more valuable areas of the Spanish Empire, so Spain was willing to negotiate to give its control to the United States. Both countries are going to come to a diplomatic solution in this. A treaty is going to be negotiated by John Quincy Adams, the American Secretary of State, and Adams-Onis, who was a Spanish envoy to the U.S. John Quincy Adams was the son of former President and Founding Father John Adams. Under the terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain gave Florida to the U.S., and the U.S. gave up claims on Spanish-controlled Texas. The treaty established a boundary line between the territories of the two countries that extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In 1822, Florida is officially going to become a U.S. territory under this treaty, and in 1845, Florida is going to become a state. So practice number 2, you're going to read the following statements and mark them as true or false. If the statement is false, you're going to use the space provided on your worksheet to change it to a true statement. Try and do this without looking at your notes first, then use your notes, check your answers. You can pause the video if you need to so you can have time to do it. The addition of so much new territory in the early 1800s between the areas of Florida and the Louisiana Purchase, all of this led to a difficult question for the federal government to answer. The question was, will the states created in the new territories of the Louisiana Purchase in Florida be slave states or free states? This problem first propped up when Missouri sought statehood. Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state, but that would have upset the balance in the Senate between free and slave states. At the time, there was an equal number of slave and free states, so that they had an equal number of senators. This helped facilitate compromise between the two sides, especially when it had to do with issues regarding slavery, because neither side had an advantage. They had to kind of work with one another. Senator Henry Clay is going to propose a compromise. His idea was to admit Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate. To settle the issue for the future, the southern border of Missouri would serve as a boundary to determine future slave and free states. States south of the border, like Florida, would be slave. States north of the border would be free. This became known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and settled the issue of the expansion of slavery for several decades in the United States. This is your final practice, practice number 3. You're going to read the following statements and mark them as true or false. If the statement is false, use the space provided on your worksheet to change it to a true statement. Try and do this without looking at your notes first, then use your notes to check your answers. And this is going to conclude our lecture on how the U.S. acquired Florida.